September 1683, the massive gates of Vienna, one of Europe's crown jewels, faced an enemy unlike anything the continent had witnessed in generations. An Ottoman war machine stretching as far as the eye could see had arrived with a singular purpose: conquest. Tens of thousands of warriors, battle-hardened and relentless, surrounded the city like a tightening noose. But here's where the story gets incredible. Against impossible odds, a band of European defenders and a legendary warrior king refused to let civilization fall. This is the tale of bravery that defied logic, strategy that changed history, and a final cavalry charge so epic it still echoes through the ages. The destiny of an entire continent was decided on these blood-soaked fields. Let me take you back to when Vienna became humanity's last line of defense. The summer months of 1683 brought an unsettling darkness to Central Europe. Anxiety rippled through towns and villages like wildfire. Traders navigating the Danube River carried disturbing tales, stories of a massive military force assembling under the Sultan's crescent moon banner. At first, many dismissed these accounts as paranoia, the kind of exaggerated gossip born from collective dread. But then the evidence became undeniable. Entire settlements emptied overnight. Sacred churches reduced to ash, columns of soldiers stretching beyond the horizon. By the time June arrived, the truth was inescapable. The Ottoman Empire had locked its gaze on Vienna once again. The army commanded by Kara Mustafa Pasha was a sight that belonged in nightmares. Conservative estimates placed his forces at 150,000 warriors, though some historians would later claim the number swelled closer to 300,000. This wasn't just an army, it was a tidal wave of military might. Elite janissaries, the Sultan's most feared infantry units, moved with the precision of seasoned killers. Sipahi cavalrymen, their armor catching sunlight like deadly mirrors, rode alongside terrifying Tartar horsemen from the eastern steppes, raiders whose reputation alone could empty entire regions. And then there were the siege specialists, artillery masters, tunnel diggers, and engineers hauling wagons groaning under the weight of timber for constructing siege fortifications. The sheer magnitude of this force made progress slow, but its intention was crystal clear. From Edirne winding through the Balkans, this unstoppable juggernaut rolled forward like an avalanche. Cities foolish enough to resist were obliterated without mercy. Those that surrendered, they were spared destruction but forced to provide soldiers and supplies to fuel the Ottoman war effort. By July, the dreaded Ottoman standards appeared near Austria's frontier. The hammer was about to fall.
Vienna wasn't just any target, it was a fortress city, the beating heart of Habsburg power. Massive stone walls, reinforced bastions, and defensive moats encircled it like layers of protection. But appearances can be deceiving. Inside those walls, the situation was desperate. Emperor Leopold I, sensing the danger, made a controversial decision on July 7th. He abandoned Vienna entirely, fleeing westward to Linz. Many of his nobles followed suit, leaving the city's defense to a skeleton garrison, barely 15,000 professional soldiers supported by approximately 5,000 armed citizens. Command fell on the shoulders of Count Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg, a man forged from pure iron will. Only 36 years old, he faced a challenge that would have broken lesser men: hold this city against the most powerful military force on earth until reinforcements arrived. Help from the Holy Roman Empire and Poland had been promised, but promises are worthless if they arrive too late. July 14, 1683, Ottoman advance units appeared on Vienna's outskirts. 3 days later, the city was completely encircled. Crescent banners lined every hill surrounding the fortress. The siege had officially begun. Ottoman encampments sprawled across the landscape like a second city constructed from silk and canvas. At its center stood Kara Mustafa's personal command pavilion, a palace of unimaginable luxury featuring flowing fountains, ornate carpets, and decorations in rich reds and greens. The contrast was striking: opulence on one side, a besieged city crumbling on the other. Kara Mustafa was supremely confident. He didn't plan to storm Vienna's walls in costly frontal assaults. Instead, he would starve them into submission, let fear do the heavy lifting. His forces dug intricate trench systems and positioned artillery that pounded the city's defenses relentlessly, day after day, night after night. Underground, miners worked in darkness, tunneling beneath the walls to plant explosives that would bring entire sections crashing down. Life inside Vienna transformed into a waking nightmare. As weeks crawled by, food supplies dwindled to nothing. Bread was carefully rationed. Water from the Danube, Vienna's lifeline, was cut off by the besiegers. Disease spread like poison through the overcrowded quarters where terrified civilians sought refuge in churches and underground cellars during the endless bombardments. Yet somehow morale didn't collapse. Starhemberg became the city's backbone, inspiring both soldiers and ordinary citizens with his unshakable resolve. He declared repeatedly that Vienna would never surrender, not while a single defender drew breath. Every time Ottoman forces advanced, Viennese defenders launched fierce counterattacks, torching siege equipment and harassing the enemy's tunnel diggers. The entire population became warriors, Women and children hauled stones, carried water, and supplied ammunition to defenders on the ramparts. They fought alongside trained soldiers as equals. For nearly 2 brutal months, Vienna endured hell. Wave after wave of Ottoman attacks crashed against the walls. Explosions from underground mines sent towers and defensive positions tumbling into rubble. But every gap torn in the defenses was immediately plugged with whatever materials were available: rubble, timber, and when necessary, the bodies of the fallen. Kara Mustafa's frustration grew. He refused to commit his full military strength in one overwhelming assault, terrified of the catastrophic casualties it might inflict on his forces. Instead, he tightened the noose gradually, absolutely convinced that starvation would crack Vienna's spirit before any relief force could possibly arrive. But Europe had heard Vienna's desperate cries, and far to the north, a Polish king was already assembling an army that would change everything.
The thunderous roar of Ottoman artillery didn't just echo within Vienna's walls, it reverberated across the entire continent. Every explosion, every desperate message that somehow escaped the surrounded fortress was a plea to all of Christendom: save us or watch Europe collapse. For Emperor Leopold I, sheltering in exile, the stakes couldn't have been more catastrophic. If Vienna fell, the Habsburg heartlands would be completely defenseless, and with them the Holy Roman Empire itself would crumble. From Linz and Passau, he sent urgent appeals to every prince, duke, and monarch across Europe. Initially, the response was disappointingly tepid. Too often, Christian Europe had failed to unite against Ottoman expansion, consumed by petty internal rivalries and political squabbles. But 1683 was different. Something fundamental had shifted. The first powerful voice to answer Vienna's call didn't come from royalty. It came from Pope Innocent XI in Rome. He viewed this siege not as merely a political crisis, but as a holy war that would determine civilization's fate. To him, the Ottoman advance represented the gravest threat to Christendom since Constantinople's fall 2 centuries earlier. He proclaimed that defending Vienna meant defending Europe itself, urging rulers to abandon their differences and forge a new crusade. Through tireless diplomacy, persuasion, and promises of financial backing, Innocent XI engineered what would become known as the Holy League, his greatest diplomatic triumph, convincing Polish King Jan III Sobieski to commit his armies to Vienna's salvation. Sobieski was no ordinary ruler. A battle-tested commander, he'd already earned legendary status for crushing Ottoman and Tatar armies at the Battle of Kotin in 1673. His soldiers knew him as a king who fought in the saddle alongside them, a rare combination of chivalrous presence and tactical genius. When Vienna's plea for aid reached Poland, Sobieski's response was immediate and decisive. Though many of his nobles expressed caution, worried about leaving Poland vulnerable, Sobieski declared something profound: saving Vienna means saving Poland. If our enemy captures that city, Krakow falls next, then Warsaw. Better to face them there than on our own doorstep. That single decision altered the trajectory of history. The Holy League was fragile, a coalition born from desperation rather than genuine unity. Alongside Sobieski's Polish warriors came military contingents from Bavaria, Saxony, Franconia, and Swabia. The fractured Holy Roman Empire, despite its many competing states, pledged forces as well. Together, they represented Christian Europe's patchwork nature, often divided, but now united by an existential threat. Coordination proved nightmarishly difficult. Ancient rivalries simmered beneath the surface. Language barriers created confusion. Commanders argued endlessly over precedence and strategy. Yet under the crushing pressure of time and Vienna's imminent collapse, the alliance held together. By September 10th, Sobieski's army, approximately 70,000 strong, had crossed the Danube and climbed into the forested hills overlooking Vienna. His troops were exhausted from a brutal forced march, but their spirits soared as they gazed down at the besieged city and the massive Ottoman encampment spreading across the plains below. The stage was set. Vienna had survived long enough. Now Europe's fate would be decided not by defensive walls but in open combat. September 12, 1683 arrived with the dawn. The hills surrounding Vienna stirred with movement and anticipation. Fields and forests that had witnessed 2 months of relentless siege were about to host something far greater: the collision of 2 colossal armies, one fighting for conquest and dominance, the other for sheer survival. The atmosphere was electric with tension. Below in the valleys, Ottoman crescent banners rippled in the morning breeze, their vast encampment resembling a second metropolis. Above on the ridges, Christian crosses rose among the trees where the relief army gathered, preparing to strike. The long night of siege was ending. The day of reckoning had arrived. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha radiated confidence. His army remained formidable, perhaps 120,000 warriors strong. Battle-hardened janissaries formed its core, supported by Sipahi cavalry, Tatar auxiliaries, and military contingents from across the empire. Siege fortifications already pressed against Vienna's battered defenses. The defenders were at their absolute breaking point. When scouts reported that a Christian relief force had arrived, Kara Mustafa remained unshaken. He believed his massive army could simultaneously contain Vienna's garrison and repel these newcomers. His strategy was straightforward: hold the advantageous high ground near the city and grind down his enemies through attrition. But his confidence had blinded him. He drastically underestimated both Vienna's defenders' determination and the ferocity of the Polish king marching to their rescue. High atop Kahlenberg Ridge, King Jan III Sobieski surveyed the battlefield spread before him. Below, the plains stretched toward the city walls, dominated by the glittering Ottoman camp with its countless tents and fluttering banners. To the west stood Vienna itself, scarred, smoking, its walls pockmarked by artillery but still defiantly standing. Sobieski understood that time was critical. Every passing hour risked Vienna's collapse, but he also recognized the vital importance of patience. The Allied army, Poles, Austrians, Bavarians, Saxons, and others, needed careful coordination, their movements precisely synchronized. A premature strike would allow the Ottomans to defeat them piecemeal. That morning, Sobieski addressed his commanders with words that would be remembered forever. "Today, we fight not for crowns or territories, but for our faith, our families, and Europe's very survival." The troops erupted in thunderous approval, and the battle plan was finalized. The Allies would descend from the wooded hills, hammer the Ottoman flanks, and drive toward the city. Meanwhile, Sobieski himself prepared the greatest cavalry charge Europe had ever witnessed. The battlefield terrain was treacherous. Ottoman forces had entrenched themselves around Vienna's eastern approaches, their trench systems and siege lines forming barriers of earth and murderous fire. To the north, thick forest covered the ridges through which the Allied army had to advance. The landscape favored defensive positions, but Sobieski transformed these obstacles into advantages, concealing his troop movements until the perfect moment to strike. The Allied forces stretched in a wide battle line, nearly 70,000 warriors strong. On the left flank, Imperial troops under Charles of Lorraine pressed toward Vienna's northern fortifications. In the center, German contingents advanced through the dense forests, clashing violently with Ottoman forward positions. On the right flank, hidden among the hills, Sobieski concealed his secret weapon, 20,000 Polish cavalry waiting for the decisive moment. The Ottomans surged forward to meet them. Janissaries, distinguished by their tall white headgear, advanced with parade ground discipline, war drums pounding rhythmically, battle cries echoing across the valley. Cavalry units wheeled across the plains while Tartar horsemen darted like predatory shadows along the flanks. By midday, the battle had exploded into full fury. Cannons thundered from both sides, smoke rising in choking black clouds over the battlefield. Muskets cracked in devastating volleys, cutting down entire ranks of soldiers. Swords and axes clashed in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Vienna itself became an active participant in the fight. From behind the battered walls, Kahlenberg ordered desperate sorties against the Ottoman siege lines, setting trenches ablaze and creating crucial distractions. The defenders, though half-starved and wounded, fought with supernatural intensity, sensing that salvation was finally within reach. The battle stretched deep into the afternoon. Allied forces pressed forward slowly but steadily, driving the Ottomans back from the wooded ridges. Kara Mustafa, finally recognizing the danger, threw additional troops into the grinding melee, determined to hold his positions, but each wave of resistance was met with even greater ferocity. The decisive moment was approaching. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Sobieski recognized his opportunity. The Ottoman battle lines, stretched thin and battered from hours of relentless combat, had begun showing cracks. The Janissaries still held firm near the city, but the flanks were buckling under sustained pressure. He turned to face his Polish hussars, the legendary winged cavalry, their armor gleaming brilliantly, great feathered wings rising majestically from their saddles. Behind them, ranks of heavy cavalry from across Europe readied themselves for the final charge. Sobieski raised his sword high and issued the order that would change history forever. The world was about to witness a cavalry charge so powerful, so perfectly executed, that it would echo through the centuries. The battlefield trembled with the desperate struggle of tens of thousands of warriors locked in mortal combat. But as the sun descended on September 12, 1683, a new sound began rising above the clash of steel and the boom of artillery. It wasn't battle noise, it was something far more terrifying, the thunder of approaching hooves. On the slopes of Kahlenberg Hill, concealed until this perfect moment, the mightiest cavalry force ever assembled in Europe, prepared to descend upon their enemy like the hammer of God. Leading them was King Jan III Sobieski, the Lion of Poland, his eyes locked on the sprawling Ottoman encampment below. The moment that would decide Vienna's fate, and perhaps Europe's future, had finally arrived. Nearly 20,000 mounted warriors stood ready, Polish hussars, German cuirassiers, and other mounted contingents of the Holy League. But it was the hussars who commanded attention and inspired awe. These were no ordinary cavalry. Clad in gleaming plate armor with long lances at the ready and curved sabers at their hips, the hussars presented a sight both magnificent and terrifying. Their most distinctive feature was the great wooden frames rising from their backs, fitted with massive eagle feathers that arched like actual wings. In the wind, they produced a ghostly rattling sound that struck primal terror into both men and horses. To everyone who witnessed them, they seemed less like mortal soldiers and more like avenging angels descended from heaven itself. Sobieski personally commanded the right flank, positioning himself at the very tip of the spear. Few kings in recorded history would have dared lead such a charge themselves, but Sobieski wasn't a ruler content to observe from safe distance. He was a warrior king. The battlefield had reached its critical breaking point. Allied infantry hammered relentlessly at Ottoman positions, pushing them steadily back toward their camp, but complete victory remained uncertain. The Janissaries continued fighting with extraordinary discipline near the city walls, their formations holding even as the battle turned against them. Sobieski understood that one devastating blow was needed to completely shatter enemy morale. He turned to his warriors, raised his sword toward heaven, and roared words that would be immortalized. "In God's name and the blessed virgins, charge for Vienna, charge for Poland, charge for Christendom." Trumpets sounded, the earth began to shake, the charge commenced. The thunder of thousands of hooves echoed across the entire valley as the cavalry surged forward like an avalanche. Dust clouds rose into the sky. Sunlight flashed brilliantly off armor and lance points as the mounted horde gained momentum. From Kahlenberg's ridges, they poured down in successive waves, unstoppable, furious, inevitable. At their head, Sobieski spurred his horse to full gallop, his royal standard held high. Around him, the hussars leveled their long lances, their feathered wings whistling through the air with that supernatural sound. The Ottomans looked up in shock and disbelief. For hours they'd battled infantry, never anticipating a cavalry strike of this magnitude. Kara Mustafa's soldiers desperately tried forming defensive lines, but time had run out. When the hussars slammed into them, it was like being struck by lightning. The sheer weight and momentum of the charge obliterated Ottoman ranks. Sipahi cavalry lines buckled and scattered like leaves in a hurricane. Infantry formations disintegrated, torn apart by lance and saber. The hussars drove deep into the heart of the Ottoman encampment, their ferocity beyond anything the enemy had encountered. Allied cavalry followed immediately behind, exploiting the breach. German and Austrian horsemen swept into the chaos, cutting down enemies and driving them into complete panic. The Ottoman battle lines, so confident that morning, dissolved into absolute chaos. Sobieski and his warriors cut directly toward Kara Mustafa's command pavilion. The Grand Vizier fled in disgrace, his army collapsing around him. What had begun as a siege of confident conquest ended in catastrophic rout. From Vienna's battered walls, the defenders watched in stunned awe. They saw winged horsemen storming through the Ottoman camp, the enemy scattering in terror before them. Cheers erupted from the exhausted garrison as the incredible truth became undeniable. Vienna had been saved. As darkness fell over the plains, the once mighty Ottoman army was in full, panicked retreat, abandoning cannons, tents, and supplies in their desperate flight eastward. Kara Mustafa's grand gamble had failed spectacularly. The gateway to Central Europe remained firmly closed. And at its heart stood the charge of the hussars, the largest and most decisive cavalry assault in European history, a moment when courage, strategy, and unity changed the world forever. As the sun dipped toward the horizon over Vienna's plains, the battlefield had transformed from organized combat into theater of pure chaos. The once mighty Ottoman army, disciplined, formidable, seemingly invincible, now faltered under Sobieski's relentless assault. Where hours before the Janissaries had stood like stone walls, now rivers of fleeing soldiers tore through the camp, abandoning tents, artillery, and treasure in their desperation. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha fled in complete disarray, his entire command structure in ruins. Messages failed to reach their destinations, orders went unheeded, panic spread faster than the Allied cavalry charge. Soldiers who'd fought with unshakable discipline now turned on one another in desperate attempts to escape the slaughter. From the hills, Sobieski's forces pursued without mercy. Every road, every river crossing became a killing ground for retreating Ottoman soldiers. The Allies pressed relentlessly, cutting off stragglers and capturing precious artillery. What had begun as a confident siege ended as a complete rout, one that would echo through history as Europe's turning point. The Ottoman cavalry, which had once swept across Europe like an unstoppable storm, lay shattered. Sipahi horsemen galloped aimlessly across the plains, their discipline completely broken by the overwhelming assault. Infantry units stripped of leadership attempted to regroup but were met with cavalry charges that splintered them within minutes. Tartar auxiliaries and mercenaries tried establishing rearguard positions, but even these efforts couldn't stem the Allied tide. Vienna's defenders emerged from behind the city walls to join the pursuit, striking at isolated Ottoman remnants and driving them further eastward. The victory was total. The success of this rout was no accident. King Sobieski's strategy had combined patience, deception, and surgical precision. By holding his devastating cavalry in reserve until the perfect moment, he avoided unnecessary casualties and struck with maximum impact. His coordination with imperial commanders ensured the Ottoman army had nowhere to regroup, transforming retreat into utter catastrophe. Even during the pursuit, Sobieski maintained strict discipline among his troops. Looting was kept minimal. The focus remained on pursuit and complete neutralization of enemy forces. This control ensured the victory would be absolute, leaving no opportunity for Ottoman recovery. Despite the triumph, the battlefield was carpeted with fallen warriors. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers lay dead or wounded, while Allied casualties, though significantly smaller, served as stark reminders of the battle's savage ferocity. Vienna had been saved, but the price had been paid in blood. For Vienna's citizens, the rout meant survival itself. For Europe, it marked the definitive halting of Ottoman expansion into Central Europe. The victory restored faith and morale across Christian states, signaling that even the mightiest empires could be challenged with courage, brilliant strategy, and unity. As night fell over the plains, Allied forces gathered to tend wounded comrades, recover the fallen, and secure the massive spoils of war. Sobieski's leadership had become instant legend. The Polish Hussars' charge would be immortalized in memory, art, and song for generations. The Ottoman retreat stretched for miles, leaving behind the scars of defeat and history's inevitable judgment. The siege of Vienna had ended, but the reverberations of this battle would echo for decades. Empires shifted, alliances strengthened. The entire course of European history had changed forever, all because of the courage of those who stood against the tide at Vienna's gates. Vienna, once trembling beneath the Ottoman shadow, now breathed the sweet air of freedom. Streets that had been scarred by enemy boots and pounded by siege artillery, now filled with the victorious cries of soldiers and liberated citizens. Joy and profound gratitude mingled with bone-deep exhaustion as defenders and allies celebrated the city's miraculous salvation. King Jan III Sobieski rode through Vienna's streets amid deafening cheers. Holy League soldiers marched in formation, their battle standards fluttering proudly, while grateful citizens showered them with flowers and blessings. Church bells rang across the entire city, calling the faithful to offer thanks for this seemingly impossible victory. For Vienna's people, this celebration transcended mere relief. It was a moment of survival against insurmountable odds. The Ottoman threat had been vanquished. The city's walls, though scarred and battered, still stood as enduring symbols of human resilience. The Polish Hussars stood at the heart of the celebrations. Tales of their fearless charge from Kahlenberg Hill spread like wildfire, transforming them into legendary figures. Sobieski himself received accolades not merely as a brilliant military commander, but as the living symbol of Christian unity against Ottoman aggression. Allied leaders were recognized for their coordination and exceptional bravery, cementing diplomatic ties that would reshape Europe's balance of power for generations. Feasts were held, prayers offered, and medals distributed, all honoring the courage and sacrifice of those who'd fought in the siege. Amidst the celebrations, the crucial work of rebuilding began. The city's fortifications had suffered tremendously under bombardment. Homes had been damaged or completely destroyed. The economy lay disrupted after months of warfare. Skilled artisans, laborers, and soldiers turned their efforts to repairing walls, bridges, and critical infrastructure, ensuring Vienna could not just survive but thrive. Merchants returned to bustling markets, bringing goods from across Europe. Farmers repaired fields and tended livestock that had somehow survived the siege. Churches and civic buildings were meticulously restored. Memorials were erected to commemorate both the defenders' bravery and the allies who'd saved the city. The victory at Vienna dramatically strengthened alliances across Christian Europe. The Holy League, composed of Polish, Austrian, and German forces, had proven that unity could halt even the Ottoman Empire's expansion. Diplomats and monarchs exchanged messages of solidarity. The battle became a powerful rallying point for collective defense against future threats. Sobieski's leadership inspired not only Poland but the entire continent. Europe had witnessed firsthand how courage, brilliant strategy, and cooperation could overcome overwhelming odds, a lesson that would resonate through generations. For ordinary citizens and battle-hardened soldiers alike, memories of the siege remained vivid and haunting. Stories of heroism, sacrifice, and miraculous narrow escapes were shared in taverns, homes, and churches. These recollections ensured the battle's legacy would live on not merely in official histories, but in the hearts of those who'd endured it. Though the city celebrated, there was somber awareness of victory's true cost. The dead and wounded were honored with dignity, their names preserved in prayers and permanent memorials. The profound lessons of resilience, courage, and unity would shape Vienna's future, ensuring the city would stand strong against whatever challenges lay ahead. By the time winter arrived, Vienna had reclaimed much of its former vitality. Fortifications stood repaired and stronger. Alliances had been cemented. The memory of the siege had transformed into a powerful symbol of hope and determination. All of Europe looked on, inspired by the courage of those who defended the city and by the decisive leadership of King Sobieski. The celebration and rebuilding of Vienna weren't merely acts of restoration. They represented the birth of a renewed Europe, one capable of resisting existential threats and protecting its people. The victory at Vienna had secured not just a single city, but an entire continent's future. The echoes of the Battle of Vienna resonated far beyond the city walls, rippling across centuries. What had begun as a desperate defense against Ottoman siege became a genuine turning point in European history, fundamentally reshaping diplomacy, warfare, and the balance of continental power for decades to come. The legacy of this battle was felt not only in politics and military strategy, but also in culture, art, and Europe's collective memory. The story of Vienna's salvation became a testament to what humanity can achieve when courage meets brilliant strategy, when divided nations unite against common threats. The Battle of Vienna proved that even against overwhelming odds, even when darkness seems inevitable, the human spirit, when united and determined, can change the course of history itself. This wasn't just a military victory. It was a declaration that Europe would not fall, that courage still mattered, and that sometimes, just sometimes, the heroes arrive exactly when they're needed most.